They then destroyed the lab that was built specifically to make this film.
NASA destroyed the lab.
NASA destroyed the lab. Well, Kodak, at NASA's behest. Because Charlie was asked to give the film to Kodak as part of a evaluation for eventually putting it out in the marketplace. So you and I could basically have... That's, by the way, what the gold film now that is commercially available in drugstores, that's a version of Charlie's super wide latitude color transparency film. It was taken to the moon. They used it to take the first generation pictures with those Hasselblad cameras. They then brought it back to the darkrooms in Houston. They then made intermediate generational copies and prints. And in the darkroom, all the offending ruins were removed. Yes. This is why this print is so important, because this is from a first generation unaltered print without the things taken off. This is now the inset showing Mitchell and showing where we did this and showing the stunning three-dimensional geometry of the glass. We call this Mitchell under glass. And yet when I talked to him on the Bell Show and debated him, he claimed to have seen nothing. And I gave him a pass at that time because I thought that part of the problem had to do with the fact that he literally could not see. This is now a close-up showing what I call the bullet hole. Notice all the 3D geometry, this amazing three-dimensional lattice, and you can see the stair steps of brilliant glass shining, and the lunar surface is overexposed. Because remember, this is very dim. This is probably the consistency of cigarette smoke. It is so fine because it's been beaten and beaten and beaten to death by an incessant micrometeoric rain. So after how many millions of years, there's almost nothing left. But there was enough left to take pictures and bring them home.
To piggyback on Bill's question, why would they leave any trace? Do they want someone to find it? Did they want you to find it?
Let me continue the logic train, and we'll get to that.
Okay.
This is a curve, a light curve of human visual sensitivity. Our visual sensitivity peaks in what's called the yellow-green, which is where the solar spectrum peaks, by the way, so that's probably not an accident. And as you can see, as we go toward the red end of the spectrum, it gets really low down here. This is the sensitivity curve. This is 100%. This would be 0. So it's really way down in the noise. And as you get toward the blue and the violet, it gets very noisy. So you really don't see, at low light levels, much of anything in the blue or the red. You may see a little bit in the green. But film, of course, has a very different sensitivity. So now we come to the astronauts. Each astronaut was outfitted, we were told, with a gold visor designed to protect them from ultraviolet light, like a sunscreen or Polaroid sunglasses or whatever. That's another NASA lie. I can prove it. Watch. If you look at the transmission curve of gold on plastic, and you look at the spectrum, and you look at the gold helmet, it turns out that the gold suppressed all the visible wavelengths of the bright lunar surface under shining bright sunlight and amplified the blue, meaning that those helmets allowed them to actually look out at the lunar surface and see the ruins of the domes. So they could aim their body cameras at any particular place to get the pictures of the ruins, which are pervasive and all over. So there's no way they could have pointed the camera where there weren't ruins, because they were inside an ancient shattered dome of glass where 360 degrees, this is a 360-degree panorama taken from one of the panoramas that Ken Johnson saved from the original prints. And you can see that most of the stuff is to the west, backscattering. Notice the geometry here. Then as you move the camera around to the north, this is where Mitchell, this is Mitchell again. This is where the grid work was that we showed in close-up. Then you look toward the sun over here and toward the south. There's much less over here. You can see that it's almost dark, the way it would be if there was no glass. And then finally back to the west again as it begins to build up in what we call backscatter, where the light is kicked back. So this panorama, taken from an original NASA print, saved from destruction by Johnson 30 years ago, somehow this print knows where the sun is. And there's no way that any accident of chemistry, development, bad lighting, light leaks, whatever. I mean, a light leak would be toward the sun, right? Why is the biggest portion of backscatter in the sky directly opposite the sun as judged by the astronaut's shadow? In other words, his very body is shielding the camera lens from seeing any sunlight.
Now, I know that some people watching this will want us to ask this question and they want to hear your answer. And that is, some people say that you've got hold of a conspiracy, but you've got hold of the wrong one. Because what you've got hold of here is evidence of back structures on a big screen in the Nevada desert, like the Truman Show. And that's what was actually being kept quiet. Now, it's not a stupid question, but I'm sure you can't answer it. Let's hear it.
We go into the book in this in great detail. To my mind, there is zero probability, and I rarely use the word zero probability, that the lunar landings were faked, given all the politics, given the Nazi backstory of what they were looking for, given von Braun, given the Kennedy-Khrushchev thing. Why would we go if there wasn't something there to go for? But the actual proof that this is not done in a studio and is actually for real comes from an anecdotal story of my own eyewitness testimony, meaning I was at JPL when we made the transition from Downey up to JPL to cover the Mariner 6 and Mariner 7 mission. And I was there as someone in the auditorium being squired around by the head of NASA Public Affairs for JPL, named Frank Bristow, was walking this guy around who was putting some little pamphlet on every reporter's seat in the auditorium, and then was led outside to hand personally a copy of this memo, whatever it was, to every reporter who was in the press room waiting for one of the press conferences to begin. So I got one and I read it, and I was flabbergasted. Because here was a guy being officially sponsored by a NASA official, handing out a document that said the entire Apollo 11 mission was just completed in a studio, a soundstage in Nevada. The whole thing is a fake. And I wished I had kept that document. We're now looking for some reporter who at the time actually as a sidebar, as a kind of a, isn't it cute what things happen around these missions, actually published a story based on that 2-page Mimeo handout. Because somebody had to have done it. Possibly at the Pasadena Star News, which is one place we're looking. Possibly even in the New York Times. I haven't looked. I haven't had time to look. The point is that there were other reporters, both well-known and no one will ever hear of them, reporters. 1,000 people were covering those missions in those days. Somebody had to have kept, just as an historical anachronism, a copy of that memo. Now what that means, as I say in Dark Mission, is politically NASA itself was starting the rumor before Neil and Buzz and Mike Collins even got home that Apollo was a fake. Why would NASA, in their wildest dreams, be starting a rumor that would mature 30 years down the road? The answer is inoculation. The answer is that if it ever came out that there was real stuff there that they were hiding, they could divert the conspiracy crowd to the fake conspiracy that we never went to the moon by planting the seeds, by planting the meme in the culture generations before, which would then bear fruit, which it did on Fox Television. Gosh, Fox Television, that's interesting. And it would divert those people from asking the real question, which of course is, what did they find on the moon, and when did they find it, and when did they decide to lie about it for all these years?
So the astronauts, even Mitchell, you're saying, had a visor that actually made it possible for them to see this wall of glass.
So they could take the pictures of the right
whatever,
stuff. Yeah.
And photograph it.
Yeah.
So when you asked Mitchell, and he said he didn't see anything, what is your theory on why he's lying?